So who actually wrote the Bible? For centuries, that question was pretty much answered by faith. But today it's a gripping detective story, one that we can piece together with clues from ancient texts and discoveries buried deep in the earth. So come on, let's peel back the layers of faith and history and try to uncover the real story behind one of the most influential books ever written. Our investigation is going to start right where you'd probably expect, with the traditional belief. But as you're about to see, if you take a closer look at the text itself, it starts to raise some really fascinating questions that scholars just couldn't ignore. For millennia, the answer was basically set in stone, passed down through generations. Tradition holds that the great prophet Moses himself wrote the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We call that the Torah, and for centuries, that was pretty much the final word on the subject. And here's our first clue. The very last verses of Deuteronomy describe in pretty clear detail the death and burial of Moses. Now, as some very sharp rabbis noticed a long time ago, how could he have written about his own funeral? It was just a small crack in this massive wall of belief, but it was enough to let all the questions start flooding in. Now, what's really fascinating is when you look closer, you find these contradictions woven right into the stories themselves. Take Noah's Ark. One passage says to take 2 of every animal, but another one says to take 7 pairs of the clean animals. The flood lasts for 40 days, or wait, is it 150? These aren't mistakes. You got to think of them more like forensic evidence, like fingerprints left behind by different authors from different times, each with their own story to tell. So how in the world do we solve this puzzle? Well, modern scholars approach it like a cold case, using 2 main tools. First, they analyze the text itself, looking for different writing styles. And second, they use archaeology, literally digging for physical evidence that can either back up or challenge the stories. And all this leads us to the main theory in biblical scholarship today. It's called the documentary hypothesis. The best way to think about it is this. The Torah is less like a novel written by a single author and a lot more like a movie that had multiple screenwriters, each one adding their own scenes and dialogue over time. And what you get in the end is this rich, layered final script. Scholars have even given these sources cool code names. You've got J, the earliest writer, who uses the personal name Yahweh for God and tells these really vivid, earthy stories. Then there's E, who's from the northern kingdom and prefers the more formal name Elohim. D is the powerful voice behind the book of Deuteronomy, really focused on law and the covenant. And finally, there's P, the priestly source, who kind of acts as the final editor, meticulously organizing everything and adding all the details about rituals and family trees. But how do we know when they were writing? Well, that's where archaeology comes in. Okay, this is the first solid piece of evidence we have from outside the Bible. It's called the Merneptah stele. It's basically a victory monument from an Egyptian pharaoh, dated to 1208 BC. On it, the pharaoh is boasting about all his conquests, and for the very first time in history, a people called Israel are mentioned by name. This places them right in the land of Canaan over 3,000 years ago. This is our historical starting point. From this point, our investigation jumps forward a couple hundred years to the time of Israel's great united monarchy, under its most famous king, a guy whose very existence was, until pretty recently, a matter of intense debate. King David. The Bible paints him as the ruler of this vast, glorious empire. But for decades, archaeologists found nothing. Not a single inscription, not one palace wall that they could tie to him. It got to the point where some skeptics were starting to argue that he was no more historical than, say, King Arthur. And then, a breakthrough. At an archaeological dig called Tel Dan, they found this. It's a broken stone tablet, a victory monument from an enemy king, and on it, he boasts of defeating the House of David. Wow! All of a sudden, we had the first proof from outside the Bible that David wasn't just a story. He was a real historical figure who founded a real dynasty. The evidence keeps piling up with David's son, Solomon. The Bible says he fortified 3 key cities, Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. And guess what archaeologists found at those exact sites? Massive 6-chambered gates, all built to a nearly identical architectural plan. This isn't a coincidence. It's the signature of a powerful, centralized government with a major construction program. But you might be wondering, how can we be sure these gates are from Solomon's time? It's a great question. And the key, weirdly enough, is a layer of ash and destruction. See, both the Bible and Egyptian records describe an invasion by a pharaoh named Shishak right after Solomon died, around 925 BC. Well, at the site of Gezer, this very gate was destroyed in a huge fire that we can date to that exact campaign. So if it was destroyed then, it must have been built before, right in the era of King Solomon. Okay, so the evidence points to a real kingdom back in the 10th century BC, which is the time of our J writer. But the story doesn't end there. In fact, the biggest reason the Bible got written wasn't about victory at all. It was about catastrophic, soul-crushing defeat. See, the Golden Age, it didn't last. The next few centuries were just one crisis after another. In 722 BC, the brutal Assyrian Empire conquered the northern kingdom, basically wiping 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel right off the map. A century later, a southern king named Josiah discovers a scroll. Scholars think it was an early version of Deuteronomy, our D source, and it sparks this desperate religious reform. But it was too little, too late. In 586 BC, the Babylonians showed up, and they did the unthinkable. They burned Jerusalem, they destroyed Solomon's holy temple, and they dragged the nation's leaders and thinkers into exile in Babylon. And it's right here, in the depths of despair, in a foreign land, that the Bible as we know it truly takes shape. The priestly writers, our P source, gathered all the sacred stories they'd managed to save, the scrolls of J, E, and D. They became the master editors, weaving these different threads into one single epic story. This wasn't just about saving history, it was a way to answer the most painful question of all. How could our God let this happen to us? This act of creation, in the face of total destruction, it wasn't just about preserving the past, it was about reinventing their entire faith for the future, and it led to one of the most significant transformations in the history of religion. I mean, think about the problem they were facing. It was huge. They had no land, no king, and no temple to offer sacrifices in. How could they stay God's chosen people? The priestly writers gave them the answer. They focused on portable practices, things you could do anywhere: circumcision, observing the Sabbath, group prayer. They basically created a portable homeland, a faith that could thrive no matter where you were. It wasn't tied to a piece of ground anymore. It was tied to a set of practices and a sacred book. And this period marks a dramatic and final shift. Before the exile, archaeology shows us that many Israelites still worshipped other gods alongside Yahweh. We find thousands and thousands of these little idol figurines. But after the exile, nothing. Zero. The crisis forced a choice, and out of those ashes, true monotheism was finally forged. And we have absolutely breathtaking proof that these texts are genuinely ancient. These are the Ketef Hinnom scrolls. They're tiny amulets made of pure silver, found in a tomb near Jerusalem. And they date all the way back to the 7th century BC. That's centuries before the famous Dead Sea Scrolls. When they were painstakingly unrolled, they revealed verses from the Book of Numbers, including the priestly blessing. This proves these words were considered sacred long before the final editors wove them into the Torah. This led them to the most revolutionary idea of all. The writers in exile came to a new conclusion. Their God hadn't been defeated. No, he was using foreign empires as his instruments to punish his own people for not being faithful. And this completely transformed their understanding of God. He wasn't just a local deity, the God of a single tribe anymore. He was the one universal God in control of all nations, of all of history. So in the end, the Bible wasn't just delivered, fully formed from on high. It was assembled piece by human hands over centuries in response to incredible triumph and terrible trauma. It's a library of voices, edited and re-edited to make sense of a changing world. So the final question is for you. How does knowing the Bible's incredible human story, a story of crisis, creativity, and evolution, change what it means for us today? That's a question we're thinking about.